Christmas, known for a time of joy, but not all tales from this season are merry. This holiday, I dive into sinister historical murders. These first two intriguing tales of murder I present to you today are set in Wake Forest, North Carolina, during the late 1940s and early 1950s. They are cloaked in mystery and whisper of evil, and their darkness still lingers within the small town's lore. Hello, and welcome to Shades of Murder. In this podcast, I discuss cases of murder around the world and throughout history, hoping to unravel the layers of darkness that help make humans into monsters. Please be forewarned that each episode contains specific and at times very graphic and disturbing details of the case. This show is not intended for all audiences, and listener discretion is strongly advised. Wake Forest, North Carolina is a beautiful, quaint town about 20 miles north of Raleigh. Currently, it is home to around 50,000 residents, full of lush trees, woodsy trails that run by lakes, and fresh, crisp air. It is also well known for its strong Baptist roots. The city was founded in 1831 when the North Carolina Baptist Convention purchased Dr. Calvin Jones' 615-acre plantation. They were motivated to establish an educational institute where future ministers could be trained. The Southern Baptist Convention selected Wake Forest as the site of its newest seminary. The Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary shared the campus with Wake Forest College until 1956. At the time of the events discussed, the town had only around 3,500 residents, which made the horrible crimes that were committed during this time even more shocking and terrifying to this close-knit Christian community, especially for those who consider themselves strong believers of the Christian faith. The Christmas season is deemed to be one of the most sacred. It was during this time that darkness invaded this community. The following cases of murder are for the most part unknown outside those who call this area their home. These are two separate tales of Raymond Downing Hare and Luna Holmes Beddingfield of Wake Forest. On December 14, 1949, 23-year-old pre-med student Raymond Hare, a senior at the Baptist College, spent all night out playing cards. He wouldn't quit despite how he continued to lose. Raymond Hare lost big that night, writing checks totaling $400, which equates to more than $4,000 today. He owed the most to 20-year-old Roy Coble, who had recently dropped out of Wake Forest College. Little did Roy realize that all of Raymond Hare's checks were bad, and no one would ever receive the money he owed them. The following sequence of events is believed to have occurred on the night of December 15, 1949. After their previous night out gambling, Raymond Hare and Roy Coble went out the next evening. They were drinking heavily, driving around and arguing over the money. Raymond Hare was in debt now to Roy. At some point in the night, they pulled over into a campus parking lot on the south side of Hunter Dormitory. Their arguing escalated and a fight ensued. There was a pistol inside the car. Raymond and Roy fought for the gun. A sudden flash blinded Raymond. The noise of the bullet firing pierced his ears. The next thing he knew, he was looking at his quasi-friend with a bullet through his head. Blood poured down his face and soaked his hair. Around 10:30 p.m., Raymond's vehicle was involved in a minor accident on campus when he struck a stone wall. When police officers arrived at the scene, they placed him in custody for drunk driving. But Raymond never mentioned that Roy was in the car. Suddenly, he escaped, disappearing into the streets around the dimly lit, quiet campus. Police then discovered beneath the front seat, splayed across the floorboard, the body of Roy Coble. His head was gushing blood, and he was unresponsive. Inside the vehicle were 4 items that painted a picture of the night's events. 1 Coca-Cola bottle, a bottle of whiskey, a revolver, and a gun holster. Inside Roy Coble's wallet were checks made out to cash, worth a sum of $8,230, all signed by Raymond Hare. Shortly upon his arrival at a hospital in Raleigh, Roy Coble was pronounced dead. Later, it was determined by the coroner that his cause of death had been from the .38 caliber bullet lodged in his head. The police were now on a manhunt for a killer. A bloodhound came in from Wilson prison camp. He sniffed out Raymond Hare's presence at literally every single garage in the residential section of town. It was believed that Raymond Hare had scoped them out, hoping that someone had left keys inside a vehicle. His exact whereabouts and movements are unknown. The next morning, it was reported from a witness who saw him getting off a bus in Fayetteville, North Carolina, his hometown. Then the trail went cold. Law enforcement had no leads, no clues. It was as if Raymond Downing Hare had vanished into thin air. In reality, Raymond Hare had snuck into his family's basement once he arrived in Fayetteville. From his parents' home, he stole $325 in cash, some food, and clothes. He then next traveled to Washington, D.C., where he met up with an old friend. This unidentified friend would later send a wire transfer to Las Vegas, where Raymond Hare would collect it under the alias J.S. Royster. Local law enforcement was now working with the FBI as he was now an official wanted fugitive. A frantic, crazed search was conducted for this tricky dental student who had escaped the clutches of the police and continued to evade capture. They were on the hunt for Raymond Hare, but he was so elusive and ahead of law enforcement agents that they had no idea what he was up to. Raymond Hare was a known card expert and an amateur hypnotist. This must have given him a unique set of skills to help avoid being caught. Meanwhile, the town of Wake Forest was petrified as to no one knew where the killer was. Residents locked their doors at night, many for the first time ever. College students were scared that he may still be in town. The State Bureau of Investigation plastered the state of North Carolina and the country at large with more than 1,000 wanted posters of Raymond Hare's picture, full name, and the crimes he had committed. This was one of the biggest news stories in North Carolina and the biggest crime story in Wake County at the time. Never before had this quiet Baptist community been the focus of national headlines, especially for a brutal slaying and countrywide manhunt. Raymond Hare's father was a highly revered church leader and dentist in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Once his parents learned that their son was a wanted fugitive for murder, they retained their son a good defense attorney. Raleigh-based attorney J. Wilbur Bunn stated that his parents were cooperating fully with law enforcement, and they would notify officers immediately if and when they ever heard from him. Now, this is where the story may spark particular interest for some of you. Someone in Southern California called in a tip to the police about whom they believed may be the man on the FBI's most wanted flyers. This suspect happened to be staying at what may be, for some true crime listeners, the most infamous hotel in downtown Los Angeles. Raymond Hare was staying at the Cecil Hotel, one of the most notorious hotels in the world, taken to another level of popularity and notoriety by American Horror Story Season 5, aptly named Hotel. The mystique and darkness of the hotel was dramatized under the fictional name Hotel Cortez. The real hotel has been the site of an unknown number of mysterious deaths, drug overdoses, suicides, and murders. The most famous of them include the bizarre drowning death of Elisa Lam and its most famous guest being that of the serial killer Night Stalker Richard Ramirez. Needless to say, it is a well-known destination in the true crime community. Raymond Hare is yet another murderer who found himself lured in by this historic hotel. Of course, he stayed there decades before it earned itself an iconic place in true crime history. I found it fascinating that the main character in this small-town crime story, A Tale of Murder, that I would be shocked if any of you had heard of before, would be found on the other side of the country, inside a hotel room of the infamous Cecil Hotel. On January 12, 1950, almost a month after the murder of Roy Coble, LAPD officers ambushed Raymond Hare's hotel room, where he had registered under the alias J.S. Royster. he was sound asleep inside and did not show any resistance to being taken into custody. In his possession was $165 in cash, one suit, an extra shirt, and a coat. Raymond Hare, when discovered, simply told the police that he had been trying to figure out a way to go back home to face the music, as he put it. On January 19, 1950, the fugitive dental student was extradited to Raleigh to do just that. Within 3 months, on April 5th, Raymond Hare faced a jury of his peers. He alleged that both himself and the victim had been drinking whiskey heavily the night of the incident. They got into an argument in which Roy Coble pulled a gun on him. There was a struggle for the pistol, and it accidentally went off, shooting Roy Coble in the head. However, autopsy reports showed that Roy Coble did not have any alcohol in his system. The jury found Raymond Downing Hare guilty of second-degree murder, and the judge handed down a sentence of 25 to 30 years. This is a pretty severe penalty for second-degree murder, considering that the defendant had no previous record. Second-degree murder is defined as intentional killing without the element of premeditation. The crime can have aggravating or mitigating factors that affect the sentence given, but the minimum time is approximately 125 months or 10 years incarceration. Then again, the defendant, Raymond Hare, did escape police custody and sent the FBI on a crazy cross-country chase for 27 days, so I am sure that the judge wanted to make a point and an example of him. While he was incarcerated, Raymond Hare was a model prisoner. In June 1952, his sentence was reduced by Governor Scott to 20 to 25 years. At the beginning of 1953, it was reduced again to even less time. Raymond Hare was resentenced to be in prison for 15 to 20 years. On December 19, 1955, almost 5 years to the date when he took the life of Roy Coble, and after his initial penal sentence was given, the parole board cited his perfect prison record and released him. I can only imagine that this God-fearing southern town was appalled by the news of this murderer once again walking amongst them. I could locate very little information about how Raymond Hare spent the rest of his life as a free man. According to an online catalog of family trees, his last known residence was on the same property that his grandparents' home was in Fayetteville, North Carolina. It was reported that prison time seemed to have changed him, and although he had never been known as an extrovert, he became extremely reclusive once he was released from prison. There is no record of whether Raymond Downing Hare ever got married or had any children. He died at 81 years old on May 14, 2007. According to the memory of a Wake Forest resident who was only a teenager when the crime happened, the citizens were horrified when they heard about this murder and the killer's escape. At the time, the victim, Roy Coble, had rented a room in the house only a block away from this girl's own family home. It was known to be a small, lawful town in the South, no less, and this kind of crime did not happen. It was Christmas time, and even though the students were out for winter break, people were absolutely terrified to walk the grounds of the dark campus. Raymond Hare became the boogeyman for this community. Over those 27 days, no one knew where he was, where he may be hiding, and where he could be lurking. This crime, especially for the time, in this small Baptist town, threw it off its normally safe and law-abiding Good Samaritan-filled Atlas. Wake Forest and the county at large were not used to such brutal violence. I find the story and criminal profile of Raymond Downing Hare fascinating because you can view him through two drastically different perspectives. First, it is possible that he was merely a college student with a penchant for drinking hard liquor and playing cards. Negative events culminated, and in a moment of drunken rage, he struggled with the gun and it went off, killing Roy Coble. The other perspective is that he was a manipulative, charming, and highly intelligent young man who was arrogant and narcissistic enough to believe that if he killed Roy Coble and ran, then he'd never have to pay his debts to him. What his true intentions were when he was driving away with his slumped-over body on the floorboard, we'll never know. I think he likely panicked and was trying to get out of the area as fast as possible to get rid of the body. But he crashed his vehicle, so he panicked and knew he had to run. I also think his background as an amateur hypnotist is bizarre and interesting, and I wish there had been more information about this element of him. It probably provided him with a unique talent for persuasion. He was helped while on the run, garnered high praise as a prisoner, and it ultimately won over the governor and then the parole board, who set him free. I have difficulty buying this theory, though, because he didn't appear to utilize his manipulative skills once he was released, instead of using his newfound freedom to get what he wanted, as you would expect him to do if he were a narcissistic sociopath. He ran back to where his family lived and settled there. The other element of this case is the injustice, when he only served 5 years. I doubt anyone would say that he did his time for murder after 5 years, no matter if Roy Cobble's death was intentional or unintentional homicide. Only Raymond Hare knows what really happened on that fateful night, but his crime and story will forever be known as one of the strangest tales of murder in Wake Forest history. What do you think of Raymond Downing Hare and his crime? Was he a master manipulator who charmed his way to freedom? Or was he a young man who made a terrible mistake and wanted the chance to redeem himself? This second Christmas-time murder in Wake Forest occurred only a few years after Raymond Hare killed Roy Coble. On Christmas Eve, 1951, Luna Holmes Beddingfield, the wife of a textile worker and a mother of 7 children, had gone out after feeding her family a nice meal for the holiday. She never made it back home for Christmas. To this day, her exact movements are unknown. Around 8 a.m. Christmas morning, about a mile past Wake Forest town limits, a woman was walking down a rural dirt road and was shocked at what she discovered. A bloodied and blue woman was lying in the middle of a muddy ditch. She appeared to be dead. The terrified woman ran back to her residence, where she contacted the police. When law enforcement officers arrived on the desolate country road, they observed that the woman's face was severely bruised, swollen, and covered in dried blood. Her lips were heavily bloated and purple with bruises. There was blood on her nose and mouth and several blue markings on the side of her face. The victim was identified as 45-year-old Luna Holmes Beddingfield. At the crime scene, investigators recorded specific items that may help them lead to the truth of what had happened. There were several grocery items, a man's brown hat, one woman's shoe, and a pair of women's panties. It was later determined that the shoe belonged to Luna Beddingfield, but not the women's underwear. There is no record as to who or how this was determined, but I can't imagine anyone except her husband being the one that the police asked to identify these items. The one shoe he recognized, but not the undergarments. I don't think it was a safe assumption for the police to make, based on his opinion alone, that the panties were not Luna's. Was it the size of the panties that wouldn't have fit his wife, or something regarding their fashion? There is no information on why law enforcement came to this conclusion, but I found this detail peculiar. Initially, the police were lost on what had caused the woman's death. They believed that it was a possibility that she had not necessarily been killed, but that she had died overnight from exposure to the cold. However, the excessive bruises and blood on her face told detectives a different story. Her blood had also not congealed, nor had her body lost all of its heat, which it would have if she had died from the freezing temperatures. This theory was entirely dismissed when the coroner's autopsy revealed that the woman's neck had been broken, and there was blunt force trauma to her skull. It was clear now to law enforcement that the dark blue purplish marks on her face, traces of blood, and injuries to her head indicated that she had been beaten to death by a man's fist. Law enforcement officers determined that the woman had been dragged 235 yards along a road known as Lover's Lane. The perpetrator, who was believed to be male, had severely beaten this poor woman and had thrown her into a ditch to die overnight in freezing temperatures. Sheriff deputies interviewed 25 people, but no one had information or details to point them in the direction of who could have brutally murdered this wife and mother of 7 kids. The day after Luna Beddingfield's remains were discovered, Police Chief Floyd Whitman Jr. announced to the press that he expected a break in the case would arrive, and soon. On December 27, 1951, 2 suspects were arrested. Tom Wheeler, a novelty salesman, and one of the victim's brothers, Vance Holmes, were brought into custody in connection with Luna Beddingfield's murder. Both men had previous records, specifically for assault. Tom Wheeler admitted to knowing Luna Beddingfield and that she had asked him to help her pick up some groceries earlier in the day on Christmas Eve. He claimed he bought what she wanted, delivered them to her residence, and then spent the remainder of the day doing errands. He said he was in bed by 9:45 p.m. and had not seen Luna after delivering the groceries that afternoon. It was recalled by homicide detectives that there had been several grocery items at the crime scene. The next day, on December 29th, both suspects, Wheeler and Holmes, were released from jail and fully exonerated. There were 3 new men brought in for questioning that same day. Carl Baker, 40, a grading contractor, Please Dean, 46, a cotton mill worker, and Sanford Wright, 29, a painter. They were all believed to be with the victim the night she was killed. All 3 men had admitted to hanging out with Luna Beddingfield on Christmas Eve. According to the words of Baker, Dean, and Wright, they were drinking and playing cards with her about a mile into the woods. The area also happened to be located right behind Carl Baker's house. Baker and Wright claimed that they left the gathering around 7 p.m. and left her alone with Dean. Dean claimed that he left Luna shortly after that, and the last time he saw her, she was standing alone at the edge of the highway. Coroner Irving Creek determined that Luna Beddingfield had been murdered around midnight. There had also been physical evidence that she had sexual intercourse shortly before being killed. Baker, Dean, and Wright were held without bond on charges of murder. Their hearing was set for January 11th. There was a 4th man police were looking for, whom witnesses had seen Luna with on Christmas Eve. His name was Oscar Penny, 28 years old, who worked for Carl Baker. However, law enforcement investigators believed that Oscar Penny was a material witness for the prosecution and not a suspect in Luna Beddingfield's murder. He was held under a $1,000 bond. Something strange was going on in this investigation, and it was believed that those responsible for Luna Holmes Beddingfield's death had people on the outside helping to change its course of justice. On New Year's Eve, 2 huge explosions rocked the site where Luna's body had been found. Police Chief Floyd Whitman Jr. reported the next morning that it was believed they had been intentionally set to intimidate witnesses. Dynamite had been tied to the trees around the crime scene, which had been set off with fuses. Someone did not want the men in custody to pay for Luna's murder, and they were trying to scare off anyone willing to testify against them. Then 2 days later, on January 4th, 1952, the men filed writs of habeas corpus with the Wake Superior Court. For those of you who may not be familiar with this term, it is a legal process where the defendant has the right to challenge their detention or imprisonment. Latin for, and I quote, "you should have the body," it is a fundamental right in the United States that anyone incarcerated can request that the court assess whether or not their detainment is legal. It upholds the principle that no one should be held against their will and helps prevent individuals from being deprived of their freedom without due process of law. Examples of writs of habeas corpus can include ineffective assistance of counsel, new evidence discovered in the case, prosecutorial misconduct, and other conditions that may challenge the legality of a person's confinement. On average, there are 10,000 reports or claims filed with the federal courts every year, with the majority of them coming from state prisoners. The success rate of filing a writ, though, is extremely low. 1.8% of prisoners who file a habeas corpus writ are ever released, and approximately 3.2% are partially successful, and in return they may receive a lesser sentence or a new trial. These 3 men held in Wake County Jail claimed that their detainment violated their rights to due process. They had been held there for 4 days while being investigated. Then 5 more days passed before they were ever charged with murder. Their claim of illegal detainment was based upon their imprisonment and restraint since December 31st, without bail being granted nor any formal hearing. From a legal point of view, I can understand why their detainment was considered unethical, if not illegal. It is a violation of due process rights to have to sit in jail for 9 days before even being charged. How long the police can detain a suspect without any charges being filed against them depends on which state you live in. This is based on one's right to a speedy trial. Most states give prosecutors up to 72 hours to decide whether or not to pursue charges against an individual. North Carolina is one of the lowest, having only 48 hours to investigate before releasing a suspect. This, of course, is only permitted if they have been arrested and is usually only designated for felony offenses. On January 11, 1952, a grand jury would determine the fate of these 3 men. They found there was insufficient evidence to charge any of them, and they were immediately released. From all information on this case, there were no future charges brought against any of these men, nor were any other men pursued as suspects in Luna Holmes Beddingfield's murder. When the grand jury refused to indict these 3 suspects on charges of murder, the investigation appeared to have just stopped and closed. No justice for Luna. No justice for her husband and children. These men, who by all evidence, although entirely circumstantial, were very likely involved in the sexual assault and murder of Luna Holmes Beddingfield, were free to live their lives without any repercussions. It is necessary to discuss this case through the lens of victimology and feminist theory. As a reminder, victimology is the study of the various elements and factors of individuals that can increase their likelihood of becoming victims of crime. In no way is this victim blaming. It is a critical part of criminology to understand how some people become targets over others, so that the system can help to prevent similar crimes from happening. Within the context of the time, place, and culture of the 1950s, this would have been a shocking story in the small Baptist town of Wake Forest, North Carolina. Women's rights were extremely limited in this era, and women were often viewed as second-class citizens. Not only were they discouraged from being involved in politics and pursuing a higher education, but women's roles were expected to be fulfilled as wives and mothers. When a woman got married, she was legally considered dead in the sense that women had 0 property rights, nor were they allowed to make any wills or contracts. Women were now viewed as the property of their husband, who could legally beat and even imprison them. Women at this time were expected to behave ladylike, proper, and put together at all times. They were expected to tend to the needs of their husbands and children, above all else. Here was this almost middle-aged woman whose alleged behavior went against the grain of all societal expectations. That she was drinking booze would have been shocking enough. That she was gambling would have been inappropriate enough, but this woman hanging out in the woods, drinking and gambling with 3 men, none of whom were her husband, would have been the essence of scandalous and immoral behavior, especially given the time and place. I can only imagine the gossip around her murder. I also can't help but wonder what the circumstances were that led her to hang out with these three men in the woods, drinking and gambling late at night on her own, no less on Christmas Eve. These are bizarre circumstances for a woman to place herself in, much less a wife and mother of 7 children in the 1950s. This is not expressed with any judgment, but I can't help but be curious why she was there. We know for a fact that she was seen by an eyewitness, if not multiple witnesses, with Oliver Penny the night she died. There was no indication that she was under any duress in his presence. Then, based on the prosecution wanting Oliver Penny to be a material witness, he must have seen or known something about what happened to Luna Beddingfield the night she was murdered. This all indicates that Luna may have been there with Oliver Penny of her own free will, but not with the other 3 men. Oliver Penny was never considered a suspect for some unknown reason, but he was important to help convict the 3 defendants accused of killing her. Was Luna Holmes Beddingfield having a fling with Oliver Penny, or maybe they were just friends? Either way, events turned very dark for Luna Beddingfield that night, by the hands of someone she knew and possibly even trusted. I find it interesting and quite surprising how law enforcement officers in this little Christian southern town fought for justice for Luna Holmes Beddingfield. They did everything they could to find her offenders and make them pay, and they did so in a very short period. Their investigation was pretty diligent, especially given the time and circumstances. They promptly gathered the evidence, interviewed multiple witnesses, and put the pieces of the story together to find 3 viable suspects, whom the prosecution charged. It was ultimately her community, and not the police, who failed her. Is it any wonder that she would have been victim blamed, especially in this era, where women were expected to live up to the highest and purest of moral standards? I am not presuming that Luna Holmes Beddingfield was doing anything immoral with these men, but if she were, that doesn't warrant any violence being committed against her, no matter what she may have done of her own free accord. Women and girls face this kind of judgment and victim blaming today in cases of sexual assault. This is the early 1950s in a small southern town. Imagine how judged she would have been and blamed for what happened to her. Is it any surprise that the jury, who no doubt equated to middle to upper class white men, would have found the case against these guys to have insufficient evidence of any wrongdoing? Now, hypothetically, what if the defendants were telling the truth and Luna was friends with these guys? Why would they have left her alone in the woods? It's not as if she had a vehicle to leave in, and this was decades before an accessible phone, so why would they have just abandoned her? There is nothing believable about their story. It sounds more logical as if they were all drinking heavily, and one, if not all of the men, got out of hand. They attempted to come on to Luna. They were rejected. They beat the hell out of her, and one, if not all 3 of them, raped her and then killed her to conceal the crime. This is all conjecture, since I have no proof of this being the case, but obviously something ominous happened in the woods that night with Luna Beddingfield, which led to her brutal death. Ever since that tragic night on Christmas Eve 1951, which ripped one of its residents away in violence, the town of Wake Forest, North Carolina, has been impacted by her murder and its subsequent lack of justice. Luna Holmes Beddingfield has become one of its most prominent spirits, whose story has been whispered about over the decades. Many people in town claim that she is still there, haunting the land she once called home, reminding the residents of how they let her and her family down. It was by chance, or possibly fate, that I ever heard of Luna Beddingfield at all, while on a Spirits of Wake Forest walking tour. We had stopped on a grassy field in the historic downtown where she once lived. We were told about her murder and the lack of justice she and her loved ones were given. Very few details were given, unlike what I have gathered and shared with you today. It was spoken of how a white fawn and her babies are often seen nearby. The townsfolk believe that it is Luna and her children, reminding them of how they failed her. I do not necessarily believe that to be true, and it sounds a bit hokey. As in all tales of the supernatural, I am open to the possibility, but I need to experience it myself to truly believe. The fall air was still slightly warm that night on the walk, and there was no wind that cooled my skin. As the narrator told the story of the murder of Luna Holmes Beddingfield, chills ran from my head deep into my toes. I visibly shivered. The energy ran up my skin and back down over and over again the entire time I stood where she once lived. I felt her presence there, and I knew that I was meant to share her story with you. Thank you so much for listening. What are your thoughts on the murder of Luna Holmes Beddingfield? Was this a case of injustice? Or is it a cold case, which shall sadly never be solved? If you have any comments, thoughts, or suggestions for ideas for future episodes, please let me know. I would love to hear from you. My contact information you can find in the episode description. Until next time, stay safe and watch out for shades of murder happening in the streets, next door, especially inside your own home. Shades of Murder was created, researched, written, and edited by Alita Caldwell. Original music composed by Stereo Code.